She was born in Torquay in South Devon, and she had a very happy childhood with an English mother and an American father, and she didn't actually go to a formal school. She was educated at home, where I think she learned her love of books and her dedication to reading, which she retained for the whole of her life, despite later on the intervention of television and radio and all those other competing areas that she basically slightly disapproved of. But she was a reader, as well as, of course, a writer. And I think this was perhaps the greatest education that she received. She learned how to read, what to read, and I think that was the basis of her career, which started when she was about 20.
This is All Saints Church, Babbacombe. When Mr. Miller came here, this was a very run-down church. It had a tin roof, and when it rained, the noise of the rain on the tin roof, you couldn't hear what the vicar was saying. And it was decided they would have to build a new church. And it was going to cost £8,000. Mr. Miller, being a rich man, decided he would give a lot of that money, something like £2,000, on the understanding that his daughter, Agatha, would be a founder member of the church. When Agatha was 2 months old, in November 1890, her parents were carrying her from Barton Road, Ashfield, and on the way they met a friend. And the friend said, "What are you going to call your little girl?" And they said, "We're going to call her Mary, after her grandmother, Clara after her mother." And the friend said, "Why don't you call her Agatha?" So, original font, Agatha, baptized here, November 1890, as Agatha Mary Clarissa Miller. And here we have Mr. Miller. And alongside it is a certificate showing all the children who were baptized at the time Agatha was baptized. And it's got the occupation of the father. So you've got butcher, you've got builder, bricklayer, the fathers. But when it comes to Mr. Miller never worked. And Mr. Miller's occupation is described as gentleman. In Edwardian times, a gentleman was someone who never worked. Agatha loved the church. She used to come here every Sunday with her father. She'd sit in the front. This is where Agatha would sit, and the father would sit here, and she used to sit by the radiator. And she would sit through the whole of the sermon with the Reverend Petty. So she always retained that love of the church. And later on, when she wrote Murder at the Vicarage, to make sure all her background of the Anglican Church was correct, she went to see the vicar of this church, the Reverend Petty, who had a vicarage nearby, just to make sure that all the background information about the Anglican Church for her novel, The Murder at the Vicarage, was absolutely correct. Till about 1916, 17, from 1890, this is where she was born, this is where she lived. And she was very fond of Ashfield, and in one of her novels, the last novel to be published, Postern of Fate, the early childhood experiences of Agatha are mentioned in this book. Her mother died in 1926, and the place was in a terrible state, but Agatha hung on to it till 1938. In 1938, she sold it to get some money to move with her second husband, Max Mallowan. In 1962, she found out that the house was been sold to developers and was going to be knocked down. And she was very upset over this. And she tried to save it, because by this time she was quite a well-known author and quite fairly rich. She tried to save it and give it to the town as a residential home for old people, but it was too late. The developers got in and they built the little bungalows that you see now on the site. It was some years before she had enough courage to come and see what had taken the place of her beloved Ashfield. And all that remained of Ashfield was a monkey puzzle tree, which was in the garden. And she rather unflatteringly said that these were the smallest, meanest little houses she had ever seen. And she was very disappointed at what had happened because she really loved Ashfield, her home. Her daughter Rosalind was born here as well.
First of all, she wanted to become a musician, and in particular a singer. But she was so shy that she couldn't sing when there was anybody else in the room, leave aside an audience. And it made her so nervous and so upset that she realized that she could never do that publicly, leave aside for a living. So as almost a next best, she decided that something to do with literature was the best idea. And I think one day when she was in about 15 or 16, her mother said, she had flu, I think, she was in bed, and her mother said, well, you've read all the books in the house now, I despair of you, Agatha, so why don't you write one?
This was the first place that Agatha used the name of Christie. It was on Christmas Eve 1914 when Archibald Christie had taken Agatha down to his mother's house in Bristol, Clifton, and it was while there that he proposed marriage. She agreed, and Archie booked a suite, the Grand Hotel. The following morning they went to Ashfield, and that was the first time that Mrs. Miller, Agatha's mother, realized that Mademoiselle Miller was now Madame Christie. And she wasn't very pleased. And on Boxing Day, they all went out to London, and Archie went off back to the war in France. Agatha volunteered to become a nurse, what is known as a VAD, Voluntary Aid Detachment nurse. She wasn't unpaid, and she worked here as a nurse for wounded British soldiers from France and Flanders. Her mother wasn't very keen on a young lady like Agatha doing nursing, but Agatha liked it and said had she not been a successful writer, then she would have been very happy being a nurse. In 1916, Nurse Christie was transferred from the temporary military hospital to the then Torquay General Hospital. She was transferred to the dispensary department. She actually qualified as a dispenser. She took the professional exams. Now, while she was here, Sister Madge had a story published, and she challenged Agatha to write a story or a book. Previously, Agatha had only had 1 or 2 poems published, but she hadn't written a book. She hadn't even thought of writing a book. And she said to Madge, what type of book shall I write? And Madge said, why didn't you write a detective novel?
First book published in 1919 or 1920, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. Rejected, long may they remember it, by 6 English publishers, and finally published by the Bodley Head.
The Mysterious Affair at Styles, which features Hercule Poirot. And needless to say, the victim dies of strychnine poisoning. So well described was the poisoning that it's probably the only detective novel to ever be reviewed in The Lancet, the magazine of the British Medical Association.
The first 6 books achieved, I think it's fair to say, a modest success, but still in post-First World War Britain, that was quite an achievement. And I think that she discovered an enthusiasm for writing and plotting and all the things that go together with mystery stories, and the public achieved an enthusiasm for her books. Of course, the 1930s were the time when she married the person who I always think of as my grandfather, Max Mallowan, and they travelled a lot to the Middle East, and that was where all the famous Middle Eastern books, Orient Express, Death on the Nile, and Murder in Mesopotamia, all the Eastern books were based. And that was, I think, one of the happiest periods of her life. I mean, she loved traveling. She was in the throes of a new marriage and all the enthusiasm. And I mean, he was as enthusiastic about archaeology as she was about detective story writing. So the combination was tremendous. And she acted as sort of unofficial photography on the archaeological digs in the Middle East and was very much, one of the team. And it's difficult to remember, although she was by that stage reasonably famous. I don't think anybody in Iraq or Syria thought of her as a famous authoress. They just thought of her as an enthusiastic wife of one of the most famous and effective archaeologists of the time.
Interestingly, this book was published 30 years after it was written. Agatha wanted to make sure that her husband, Max Malone, would not be financially hard up when she died, because she was a lot older than him, and she had it published after she died, and all the royalties would have gone to Max after her death. But he was quite a prominent archaeologist, so he probably didn't need the royalties anyway. But it was dedicated to her second husband, Max Malone. You see, there's a number of these plaques around the town, and they're all places which have some connection with Agatha Christie. And they have the plaque put up outside the building. In 1990, on the 100th anniversary of Agatha Christie's birth, the crime writers held their symposium in Torquay. And this bust, the only one in the world of Agatha, was unveiled by her daughter Rosalind Hicks, and it is by a Dutch sculptress, Carol van den Boom Cairns.
Of course, after the 1930s came the war, and everything was put on hold then, although she continued to write books during that period. You didn't become more famous as a writer when other things like that were going on. I think it was really the 1950s when she became a household name, and that coincided with the appearance of the plays, the Mousetrap, Witness of the Prosecution, and Spider's Web. And I think that was the time when, by this stage, of course, we've passed seamlessly into the time when I was around. That was the time when, if she went out to a restaurant, she just began to be recognized sometimes. I mean, before that would never have happened, but she appeared at first nights of plays, although she was terribly shy. She was absolutely fascinated by the theatre, because although she had learnt by then how to fool readers on the printed page, she was fascinated by the challenge of fooling and readers in a live, not readers, but viewers in a live audience, so that they could not guess the murderer by the end. And of course, The Mousetrap has become probably the most famous play in British theatre.
Mousetrap plays continuously from 55 years. And the first actor to play the lead was Richard Attenborough, before he was even known as an actor. Since 55 years there have been 2 mise en scène. And now it's an institution like the Monarchy or the Tower of London or the House of Parliament. It's on the list of things to see for tourists and for English people as well.
There are still a lot of people who live in England who haven't seen it, believe it or not. I think it is a wonderful play. Apart from being a wonderful play, it has 1 or 2 other advantages as well. It is comparatively short, and that means you can take your 80-year-old grandmother or your 13 or 14-year-old granddaughter or grandson, and you can go out for a family party and have a really good evening. And I should emphasize that the Mousetrap is not there just for show. I mean, it is still a hugely successful business. Indeed, I'm told by the producer that in the whole, however many years, 55, 56 years it has been on, it has never had an unprofitable week. She was very much, as I said right at the beginning, a book person. I think that what mattered to her was that she wrote the best books possible for what was by then a huge and slavish following, and those were very much her priorities. And if occasionally she was able to, or rather others were able to produce a film dramatization that pleased her, then that was a bonus, but it wasn't really part of her career. And then right at the end of her life, Murder on the Orient Express appeared, produced by Richard Goodwin and John Braben, and with Sidney Lumet directing. And that was virtually the last really serious film she saw before she died. And I'm very happy about that, because I think, and she was very happy with Murder on the Orient Express, and I think that restored her confidence in film and TV.
Everybody reads Agatha Christie like they read, they read Enid Blyton and then they go on to Agatha Christie sort of a bit later in their life. But this particular subject came to me because my daughter Daisy, age 9, was reading this book, and she just never lifted her head from the page. She was reading, reading, reading. So finally I thought that this must be a very good book. I looked to see what it was, and it was Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. So I read it again then, and I suggested it, and that's how it all started. My partner, John Braben, went to have lunch with her, and she said, "Oh, you made Tales of Birks Potter." She liked that very much, and she thought we'd been very true to the author. And she said, "That's the thing that's really important to me, that these films are made in the right spirit," and so on and so forth. And I think she thought that we took it very seriously, Orient Express. And I think also she was very pleased with the results, in the sense she liked the film, but also because it was very successful in the box office. It really got her approval, and she gave us the rights for the other movies. The train was very glamorous, and luckily, when we went to get the money, we went to Paramount, and the people at Paramount said, "Oh, Agatha Christie, it's boring stuff, it's not very interesting." But at that time, Paramount had just been bought by Charlie Bluedorn, who was a mogul in making companies up out of all sorts of conglomerate bits and making a huge fortune. And he said, "Orient Express? I remember that. I was a waiter on Vienna Station when it used to come through, and I used to think how glamorous it was, how wonderful it was." And so we went ahead with the picture with Paramount, and they never really believed in it. We were lucky enough to get Sidney Lumet and a very good script from Paul Dane. And Sidney, being an ex-child actor himself, wanted to do it high glamour, and indeed that's what happened. We had this fabulous cast.
Every character was played by a major star. It was astonishing. In fact, Richard Widmark, who played the murder victim, said he agreed to do it just to meet all the stars. And I have to say that the first few days were very starstruck. Sidney Lumet, our director, had the very good idea of having a rehearsal so that everyone could get to know each other and forget all that nonsense. And it was an intensely pleasurable thing.
Sidney was one of the few directors who really knew how to deal with them. I mean, he said to them, I remember on the first day of rehearsal, "Listen, if you've got any problems about your character or anything, don't come to me. I just don't want to know. I haven't got time to talk to you all, so just play it as you think it should be. And that's what they did, and jolly well, I thought.
I was in heavy disguise. I was playing this Hungarian count, Andrényi. I had a moustache and I had a curled hair, and but anyway, in order to get myself all bouffant and in the morning, I used to sit next to Ingrid Bergman in the hairdryer, and that for me was, I mean, that was thrill enough, just to be in proximity to a star of this luminosity. But of course, she was going through the reverse process. She was playing this sort of mean and miserable Swedish lady, and being completely deglamorized as I was being glamorized.
Ingrid Bergman, who at the age of 60-odd was still one of the most attractive women I've ever met in my life.
She won the Oscar for this amazing, performance.
We shot the train stuck in the snow at Pontarlier, and then we had to come back to England and then get back again to Paris, to the Plan de Saint-Denis, which is just the north of Paris. We built all the station there and all the crowds and everything. We only had one night to shoot it in. Our train was there, and we decided to do all the stars coming on the train first, and then we would shoot the loading of the train and the train leaving the station. But while we were shooting all the stars and everybody was looking at the stars, all the food that was going to be loaded onto the train was stored in the goods wagons next door on the neighboring platform. And to our surprise, and extremely foolish of us, the crowd, which were numerous, opened the doors on the other side of the wagons and took all the food out. So when we came to load the train, all the sides of beef and the baskets of oysters and all those glamorous things you see being put on the train had disappeared. So I remember having to go to Les Halles, which was still working in those days, and buying a side of beef and buy oysters and all that kind of thing to reload. It cost a fortune.
I'm totally convinced that the whole world is sort of a Agatha Christie land. I remember going to Egypt for the very first time and being very excited to go to the pyramids. And, as one made one's way towards the pyramids and they emerged from the mirage, I couldn't believe it. There was a film crew filming, and not only a film crew, but a film crew that I knew, because they'd all worked on Murder on the Orient Express. And they were filming Death on the Nile. And I thought, oh my God, there's no escape. The whole world is a movie set.
Anthony Powell is an extraordinary costume designer, because, one of the great problems for actors and stars especially, the first time they come in contact with a character is when they have to put on their costume in a fitting. And the designer who's there has to be exactly the right kind of person and convince them that the costumes are right for them, and he has to have the kind of personality that they won't actually argue with, and they'll become enthusiastic about the part from that moment. It's a real trick, and when you talk to him, you'll find that he gives that incredible sense of knowing exactly what's what, and he's really very good at that. And I think his designs, his costume designs for Death on the Nile are absolutely wonderful.
What interested me about, and the idea of, when it was suggested that we worked together making this film of Death on the Nile, particularly with Death on the Nile, I think, it seemed to me that the people that she was writing about existed in a sort of never-never land. It was difficult to pin down exactly the period. It's somewhere set in the 1920s, the 1930s, but it's very kind of amorphous. When I got down to designing Death on the Nile, I decided to go for this and to not mix up the periods, but to blur the boundaries between the different parts of the 1920s, the 1930s, even periods after the First World War in the 1916, 1917, depending on the character, whichever period suited the character best. So, I mean, the elegant young people were the most up-to-date, and they were mainly dressed in kind of early 30s, late 20s, early 30s, whereas the Betty Davis character was really dressed in a much earlier period. Betty Davis, I was terrified of meeting her. I'd never met her. I knew the reputation, and I expected her to be difficult and temperamental and a sort of grande dame of the cinema, which indeed she was.
How would a little trip down the Nile suit you?
There's nothing I would dislike more. There's two things in the world I can't abide. It's heat and heathens.
Good. Then we'll go. V.O.S. pack.
She produced these sheets and sheets of paper, and she said, right, I've made a list of what I'm going to wear in the film. And so she read these 4 foolscap pages of ideas, and they were just terrible. They were wrong for the character, they were wrong for the period, they were absolutely ghastly. And she said another thing is that every film that I've ever done in my life, the designers have put me in hats, and I've worn hats and hats. So she said, in this film, I don't want to wear any hats at all. So she went upstairs, and 5 minutes later she came down with this blonde wig, which was sort of halfway between Shirley Temple and Mary Pickford. It was curls, 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 curls. And I thought, well, now, this is the moment when the battle is lost or won, because if I don't say something now, this is going to be a catastrophe, because everything that she's suggested, they're all terrible, terrible ideas. And I said, Miss Davis, could you just come over to the mirror here on the wall at the moment? And I said, now, can you look in the mirror? So she looked in the mirror. And I said, now, Miss Davis, what you're looking at is one of the most famous faces in the world. It's an iconic face. It's a face that everybody in the world knows. And I said, at the moment, all I can see is lots of blonde curls. She said, Peggy, you know what? This kid knows what he's doing. Why don't we just leave the whole thing to him? And so after that, I designed the things, and she fitted them, and she wore everything that I'd designed. She wore hats in every single scene all the way through. And I've got a photograph, which is very amusing, which she signed about the hats. But she was such a pleasure to work with, because she was super, super professional. The most fun ones to work on are always the most eccentric ones, because you can go a bit crazy. So, I mean, for instance, the Angela Lansbury character in Death on the Nile, Salome Otterbourne.
No.
Oh, the old Nile's a bit choppy tonight, monsieur.
It is true there are disturbing currents. Here we are. No. In there.
Bonsoir.
Bonsoir, madame.
Really, the character was very, very unlike Angela Lansbury in real life, who's a very sort of statuesque, has beautiful manners person. And there was this crazy sort of old drunken, over-the-hill novelist in the film, and it was somebody very different to what she was like as a person. But I think we found it was great fun to find a solution to that, and I just hope that, you know, we didn't go too far.
And I shall teach you to do it richly, as it was done in old Spain when it was known as the chica, that is to say, with a sensuous erotic dash.
I do remember when we were in Egypt that they suddenly wrote in a new scene for Mia Farrow. We hadn't allowed for an extra costume for Mia Farrow for this scene. So I said, well, we have no fabric and we're in the middle of the desert. What can we do? And we've got to have a costume by tomorrow. And so we found a tea towel, you know, for drying dishes when you wash the dishes. It had been white linen with wonderful multicoloured stripes going down, and I thought there's just enough to make a jacket in that tea towel. And the trouble was that it was covered in garlic and olive oil and stains and wine stains and all the rest of it. And so we washed it and washed it and washed it and bleached it and bleached it and hung it out in the sun. And in the end, we managed to make a jacket. I remember putting it on Mia Farrow, and she said, "Yes, this is very nice. This is very pretty. I like this very much." She said, "Can you smell some garlic?" I can't smell. You must be imagining it. The first one was Death on the Nile, and the second one was Evil Under the Sun. And of course, Evil Under the Sun was Agatha Christie wrote it, I believe. I think the hotel that she wrote it about is still there. It's on an island off the south coast of Kent, I think, and the hotel still, it's this wonderful Art Deco hotel, and it still exists. And that's what she had in mind when she wrote it. But for various reasons, we shot it in Mallorca.
I didn't particularly want to do another Agatha Christie or that type of picture. But I was building a house out in Mallorca. Richard said, we're looking for a location. It's got to have a beach, it's got to have a hotel, it's got to be miles from anywhere, it's period, it's got to be no... and they couldn't find the answer. And of course, I held my hand up and I said, why don't you come and shoot it in Mallorca? And they said, but that's full of tourists. I said, no, it's not. If you know where to go in Mallorca, it's the most marvelous island. I showed them all the locations because it was so easy to find. And I thoroughly enjoyed shooting. I went to work every morning in a motorboat round to the locations. Since then, I've had a lot of problems with the Mallorquins who keep on saying, where did you shoot this? We know this island, we were born here. I know the hotel that you shot at, but that is in the middle of the island. You cannot see the sea from there. Where was that? It's impossible. And they just do not understand the magic of movies. You know that you take a window piece and you put the window wherever you want. And the other way, you do somewhere else on the island. So all the bits and pieces work together. The whole story takes place on an island. The ideal hotel doesn't exist. It has to overlook a small beach. I found a small beach that was perfect. There was nowhere else on the island. So we built a false front the art department built 3 stories high, just a false front. There was a wonderful finca in the middle of the island that had the gardens, all the things that we wanted, which we pretended was the other side of the hotel. And if you came up to the hotel, that aside, you came in and there were big arches. And so we combined 2 or 3 places. I remember it was a very happy production because all the actors and actresses got on extremely well, particularly in Evil Under the Sun because they're all British. English actors support each other tremendously well. They're all trained stage, and there's a long tradition of backing each other up, which you don't find so much with American actors. Peter, as you know, has an extraordinary ear. He speaks Russian, he speaks français très bien, sans accent.
Hercule Poirot, enchanté, madame. Oh, if I could have a crème de cassis or sirop de banane. Do you have banana syrup?
My joy was to get him into a bathing costume, a period bathing costume that Anthony Powell found somewhere, and that awful rubber cap. And I thought there'd be complaints of Peter, but no. I mean, he was absolutely delighted to play the buffoon. Just one toe in the water and then the exercise. I mean, Peter, as a comedian, is absolutely delightful.
Hi, morning, Poirot. Been swimming?
You saw me?
No.
Yes, I have been swimming. There's nothing like the shock of cold water and rhythmic movement to stimulate the little grey cells.
I went to New York to see a couple of the actors. Sylvia Miles, you know, who was the most amazing woman. You know, she was one of Andy Warhol's girls in the factory, and she was in several of his films, and she was really over the top eccentric and wonderful, and like nobody I'd met before. But all of the actors again were very, very cooperative, and I had very strong ideas with all of them actually about how I wanted them to look, and they were generous enough to fit in with those ideas.
He's such a perfectionist, and he has that wonderful ability that he takes the actor and the character and designs a wardrobe that is period, yes, but that is flattering to the actor and yet illustrates the period.
The camera has this wonderful way of sensing untruth, and so you have to take, with an actor, you have to take the quality that they have naturally, inherently, and you have to work with that. And sometimes they've been very well cast, and the character that they're playing is, you know, is almost themselves. And other times it's completely different to the person that they are naturally themselves. And so in that case, you have to take who they are and the qualities, the natural qualities that they have, and the demands of the script and the character in the script, and you have to bring them both together in the middle somewhere. But I don't think in the cinema you can just change people totally in an unrecognisable way that doesn't use any of their natural qualities, because the camera rejects it. The camera sees falsehood there. It's a very interesting process.
I think, extremely successful Agatha Christie with the Cole Porter music. And it's sort of just 6 inches off the ground all the time. I think the number You're the Top, with sung by Diana Rigg and Maggie Smith, is great fun number, and it's certainly worth watching the DVD just for that.
You're the nimble tread of the feet of Fred Astaire. You're the National Gallery of Art salary, you're Camembert. You're the Nile, you're the Tower of Pisa. You're the smile on the Mona Lisa. I'm a worthless check, a total wreck, a flop. But if, baby, I'm the bottom, you're the top.
I've never forgotten it. Out flew the web and floated wide. The mirror cracked from side to side. The curse has come upon me, cried the Lady of Shalott.
Mirror Cracked was an interesting one because it had Elizabeth Taylor and Angela Lansbury. And that's the first time they were ever together since they were evacuated in the war from Britain as children, and they went to Hollywood, the two of them. And they'd never been together in a film till The Mirror Cracked.
I was the new boy to Agatha Christie in the sense that Richard and Lord Brabourne had done two very successful Agatha Christie pictures, and it was not difficult to attract leading lights like Elizabeth Taylor or Hudson, Tony Curtis. They didn't need much persuasion to come and play Agatha Christie. The casts of the Agatha Christie pictures were the fun. Miss Marple lives in a quiet little village, and it's invaded by some horrid people from Hollywood. And so, you know, one's got to play the balance. But Miss Marple is the Poirot of the situation. I think Angela was the front runner. There was no English actress of a certain age at that period who meant anything in America, and one of the advantages of Angela Lansbury that she was a very considerable name and popular in America, so that helped, obviously, the production.
A little bit closer, please, ladies. Lola, dear, you know there are really only 2 things I dislike about you.
Really? What are they?
Your face.
Yes, always. I mean, they're always jealous. Where's my close shot?
Jason, will you get that creep out of my eye line?
Cut.
Who? Who, me? Why, was I in your eye line? Oh, but I just wanted Jason to see my costume.
Elizabeth was wonderful because she's always late, as you know. I mean, she's professionally always late. And there's one thing I cannot stand is because you can't work if the actors aren't there. And she was staying at the Savoy Hotel. And I said to my assistants, and I had 2 wonderful assistants that I've always had, and I said, we are never going to line the camera up and wait for Elizabeth. We are 1 hour from the Savoy, bribe the hall porter at the Savoy to ring you when Elizabeth leaves the Savoy, so we know that she's on her way. And the first day she was called, I think, for 10 o'clock or something like that. And she turned up about 11, and a very cool second assistant said, oh, hello, Miss Taylor, you know. And she was expecting, you're here, quickly, wardrobe, hairdressing, da, da, da. That obviously threw her a little bit, and she came on the set, and we were working on something, because I was plenty to do without Elizabeth. And right, we'll shoot again. And she went off and she said to the first, he said, your governor doesn't give a shit whether I'm here or not. And he said, well, no, he won't line up until he won't get the camera anywhere near. And And then you could see the little wheels turn because she's a good old pro. She starts to wonder whether she'd been cut out of the scene. And then we'd just do one shot at the end. And from then on, she was always on time.
Hercules parrot, sir.
Well, Mr. Perrault? Poirot.
I've had a bet with my daughter here that you're Hercules Porridge, the famous French sleuth.
Not quite. I'm Hercule Poirot, the famous Belgian sleuth.
Poirot. Oh, Perrault, right.
C'est le comble. My name is Poirot.
Ah, the famous Monsieur Poirot?
Monsieur Hercule Poirot?
What a funny little man.
Obviously a frog.
Hercule Poirot is one of the great, I think, one of the great creations in crime fiction.
I don't think Poirot was like anybody. You know, he was. I think my grandmother saw a Belgian refugee somewhere in the south of England in the late, 1919 or 1920, and who had a rather strange shaped head, and that was it.
Hercule Poirot was described by Agatha Christie as being the most meticulous man, with his wax moustaches and his hair nets and the nets to keep his moustache in shape at night and all that kind of thing. That side of it, I think Albert Finney did terribly well. Albert was at the height of his acting abilities at that time. He, at the head of that huge cast of stars, is probably the only person who could have carried it off. I mean, he was just superb. Peter Ustinov was much more, a much more expansive Hercule Poirot, and I think probably much funnier.
For me, he is Hercule Poirot. Although perhaps physically he's not exactly what Agatha Christie described, I felt that he captured the spirit of the character so wonderfully. He was the most wonderful, wonderful man, and the most talented and generous-spirited and sweet and funny, and just total pleasure to work with. But I think he created an unforgettable character on screen.
My God, you're a wonder, Poirot.
Miss Marple is slightly more interesting because she's not an official detective. She's just a lady in the village who becomes an amateur sleuth.
And I suppose if I have a favourite, between one and the other, it would probably be Miss Marple. I think she has an essential Englishness about her, which I think the British at the moment, if I may say so, sadly underestimate.
What is that girl up to?
So I suppose I'm a Miss Marple man, if you force me to choose between one or the other.
Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot are sort of actor-proof. One generation has its own Poirot and Marple, and then they hand it on to the next.
The thing about Agatha Christie is that you never saw any blood, and I thought that was so interesting because the crimes were just as horrifying, but they weren't described in horrible technicolor detail, and it worked just as well.
She was passionately against violence, and I think she tried her best to avoid, bloodletting in her books. She wasn't always successful. Richard says there's never any blood. That's not quite true, actually, but there are some bloodthirsty scenes, but they're always sort of described slightly decorously so that you aren't really upset by it.
In Death on the Nile, blood comes under the door after one of the murders, and the Agatha Christie family thought there was too much blood coming under the door, and so we cut it out. And I have to say they were right. But that was the maximum level of that sort of thing. You never saw daggers going in or being withdrawn. If you remember in Orient Express, they all do the stabbing, but it's all very remote. And I think that's the secret of Agatha Christie. It's all in the mind and not on the screen. I think her characters seem a little bit cardboard to us now, but in those days they weren't. So I think she was quite good at characters.
Many writers, whether they realise it or not, have a kind of gallery of people that they're drawn to and attracted to and write about. And I think that Agatha Christie was certainly, I think that's certainly true of her. But as I say, they're all very, very, very clearly defined, and clearly you recognise the characters straight away, which for a designer, I mean obviously, and for an actor as well, make it much easier to portray. I suppose the first thing anybody thinks about with when the name of Agatha Christie is mentioned is, first of all, amazing plots for all of her novels, and always, 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 it's the one person that couldn't possibly have done it.
Every single person, including the butler, is a potential suspect.
You eliminate somebody because he couldn't possibly have been there at the time to do whatever crime it was. And then you realise that he could have been. And it's the genius of Agatha Christie that she always makes that plausible. There are many stories of Agatha Christie, but basically there are two main plots, and we did the two main plots. She's an extraordinary writer in the sense that they're extremely easy to read. But the plots, if you really analyse them very, very closely, are quite similar. And but most people never realise that.
For me, Agatha Christie suggested a whole England, a sort of interwar England. If I may sum it up in a word, a genteel England, when there were colonels and vicars, and even the crime wasn't barbaric, it was sort of genteel. A world, of course, that's gone. And I think that's part of the appeal of her works, that there is this nostalgia for another kind. Maybe a more class-ridden society, but one that moved at a slightly slower pace.
Every airport I go to in the world, there's Agatha Christie books. Down in the village here, there are Agatha Christie books. The lady must be doing something right.
My grandmother wrote Curtain, which is the book in which Poirot dies, quite a long time before 1975, I think probably in the late 1940s. But she was persuaded by her agents and publishers that this was not perhaps a very clever idea, and so she put it away in a cupboard, so to speak, and it reappeared actually when she knew that she was not able to write books any longer, so that she knew she wasn't damaging Poirot's future as far as books are concerned. That was 31 years ago now, and hardly a day passes when I don't miss her in one form or another, either as a person or as a source of advice or for the many other things that she provided in my life. When I knew her very well, I mean, she was in her 70s. Didn't stop her writing books, and you can't tell me that writing a book, however experienced you are, is easy physically. But she did it because she felt she had a great debt to her readers, her regular readers, and she knew they expected one every Christmas, so she went on writing.
The list of the works that she produced, it's almost inconceivable that one person could, produce so much. I can't imagine she ever existed without a pen in her hand.
She must have had a terrific sense of humour, I think, because famously she said she was terribly lucky being married to an archaeologist because, the older she got, the more interesting he found her, which I think is very witty and very funny.
I certainly don't see her as a mystery woman, but really quite straightforward mystery writer. I mean, she didn't make a great fuss about it. She just had this huge talent.